So, a very warm welcome to everyone who is joining us from different parts of the world today. My name is Swasti Raizada, and I work as a policy advisor in the energy program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. For most of you who are joining this webinar today, we all know that this year the UN Climate Change Conference will kick off on November 11th in Baku, Azerbaijan, with a focus on a cornerstone of global climate action, which is finance. Parties will be negotiating a new collective quantified goal NCQG, a more ambitious, transparent, and predictable climate finance target that better addresses the needs of developing countries for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. There's still much to settle, from the scale of funding to questions about responsibility. Who contributes, and what exactly will the finance cover? There's also a debate on not just the quantity, but also the quality of finance. As we all know, this is also the last COP before the February 2025 deadline to update nationally determined contributions, building momentum for ambitious national commitments. It is essential that NDCs reflect the outcomes of the global stocktake adopted at COP28, notably the landmark decisions to transition away from fossil fuels. To create awareness about these issues, we welcome you all to this webinar where we will be discussing the current state of play for climate finance ahead of COP29. And we intend to hear from climate experts from India in this particular webinar. Before we kick off the event, a few housekeeping rules. Please note that this webinar is going to be recorded. Participants shall receive the recording after the event, and this will also be uploaded on ISG's YouTube channel, which goes by the name of ISG Video. With a webinar of this size, we will unfortunately not be able to take questions directly from the audience, but we do have a Q&A box that participants can use to post their questions, and we will come back to them post the panel discussion. Finally, we would like to emphasize that this webinar is being organized in the spirit of enhancing global cooperation on climate change and climate finance, and we intend to build bridges through this webinar for further discussions. With that, I would like to invite our keynote speaker, uh, who I think though is running late. Runa, can I confirm Mr. Abhishek is not here yet, right?
That's correct. No, he hasn't been able to join yet.
Okay, so then I guess I'll pass it on to you, Runa, to introduce the panel. We have a stellar panel with us today, some really big stalwarts in the space who will intend to brainstorm and discuss further. And Runa Sarkar from IIM Calcutta will be moderating this panel discussion. With that, over to you, Runa. We will accommodate Mr. Abhishek Acharya once he's joined the call.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Swasti. Thank you for that. Yes, indeed. Mr. Acharya is actually traveling and he's going to join us as soon as he can. But we'll go ahead with this discussion. And of course, we look forward to his interventions whenever he joins us. So IIM Calcutta and IISD are very happy to host this webinar on the state of play, unpacking the climate finance landscape. And, we are being joined by a set of stellar panelists who have both a bird's eye view of the climate finance landscape, and they have worked at the grassroots level to harness this finance for climate-based action. Thank you to each of you for agreeing to be a part of this panel. And thank you to all of you participants who have joined us this afternoon. The challenge of addressing climate change is that what we have done over 2 or more centuries in terms of power generation, industrialization, mobility, and in general mechanization, if you will, of human activity, has to be transitioned in the very short time frame of 30 to 50 years. There's an urgency to take this action in the present to avoid accumulation of climate risks in the future. Further, such investment in humanity's collective future is to be incurred by a set of stakeholders who may or may not benefit directly from this. And therefore, this is viewed as an expense. Catalyzing such action would require economic and social adjustments, beginning with additional resource mobilization, capital reallocation, and financial structures supported by adequate regulations, market mechanisms, and effective institutions. And in that context, therefore, is the study of climate finance, which includes the flow of funds to all activities addressing climate change across economic sectors globally, and financial market activity and trading in carbon markets, etc. Now, IIM Calcutta, through its Building Roadmaps for Industrial Decarbonization and Green Economy, the Bridge Initiative, has put together or is putting together an open access book addressing these multiple facets of climate change, with lessons for the Global South to be published by Routledge in April next year. And the idea of this panel discussion is to share some of the ideas from that volume and to develop a more nuanced understanding of the related issues so as to hopefully better inform proceedings at COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. Before I proceed further, I'm very happy to see that Mr. Vishek Acharya has been able to join us. So before we start the panel, to make my job easier and I don't have to set the context anymore, Mr. Acharya, over to you to please set the context for this discussion. Of course, I would like to quickly introduce you. So, please give me a minute to be able to do that. Mr. Abhishek Acharya is a director at the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Government of India. He is an officer of the Indian Economic Service and has been serving the Government of India for the last 16 years. His area of expertise include climate change and climate finance. He has served as the climate finance negotiator in the UNFCCC for COP24, 25, and 26. He has acted as the like-minded developing countries coordinator in climate finance negotiation in COP25 and 26, and represented India in the first technical expert dialogue in the new collective quantified goals on finance under the Paris Agreement. A postgraduate in economics with a specialization in environmental economics and international economics, Mr. Acharya has served as the Deputy Superintendent of Police in the state of West Bengal before he joined the Indian Economic Service. We are very, very happy to have you with us, Mr. Acharya, and would love to hear from you to set the tone for this webinar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarkar. And it's an honor for me to share the same platform with my mentor, Mr. Deepak Dasgupta, sir, who had been my super boss in Ministry of Finance during the time 2011 to 2013. And I'm ever grateful to him for learning so much on climate finance from him. I mean, this is one of the things that people say is that learning from the master, and I have truly learned from the master, who is along whom with I'm sharing the panel. So before we proceed, I just wanted to have a brief context setting for the upcoming COP. This COP is going to be the COP for finance, as we know. And one of the most important things that are going to be discussed on this particular COP is going to be the new collective quantified goals on finance. And after 2021 on COP26, after the CMA3 decision came, there has been around 8 technical expert dialogues that has been organized by the ad hoc working group set up under the UNFCCC, under the CMA, which is the Conference of Parties for the Meeting of Parties under the Paris Agreement. Couple of issues that are emerging from the recent discussions that have taken place under the technical expert dialogues can be mentioned as the divergence between the developing and the developed country parties with regard to the quantity, the quality of climate finance. And from India's perspective, we have been strongly advocating for upholding and augmenting the scope, scale, and speed of climate finance to be provided by the developed countries towards the developing countries. If we see the Article 4.3 of the convention, it is very much clear that the responsibility lie with the developed country parties for climate finance, which mandates the developed countries to provide new and additional financial resources to the developing countries to meet their full and incremental cost of implementing required measures. But as we see from the needs determination report or the biennial submission that are being provided in the UNFCCC, the provision, mobilization, and flow of climate finance have been abysmally low. And also with the upcoming Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue on climate finance, which is the Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, we have seen there has been pressure from the developed country parties towards channelizing the climate finance from the needs of the developing countries towards putting emphasis on more towards the mitigation impact. So therefore, as we see, it has been a huge problem for the developing countries to access the climate finance as required, because the provision and mobilization and of course the flow has been very low. So this COP needs to determine what exactly we are supposed to get from the developed country parties with respect to the new collective quantified goals. As we know that after 2009, the Copenhagen decisions, the $100 billion goal has not been kept with their promise, and even in 2020, in 2021, the goal post have been shifted to 2025, which shows that how much of failure that the developed country parties have been developed country parties have maintained in provision of climate finance flows. Hence, it is very much important to have, at least for this COP, to understand what sort of granularity, what sort of components we need for the climate finance, to cater to the climate actions of the developing countries. And it has to be the needs-based approach, at bottom-up approach, that require to understand the burgeoning requirement of the climate finance for developing countries' actions. So with that, I will stop here. Unfortunately, I have to attend another meeting for which I'm already late, but since I had promised, and it's always a delight to see Deepak sir again face to face, even with through the virtual communication. Thank you very much for inviting me for this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Acharya. And, as I said, you've made my job easy. You've set the tone. And it helps us move smoothly into the rest of it. And thank you for taking out the time despite a really, really busy schedule. Appreciate it. So let me then move into the very pleasant task, if you will, of introducing our panelists. And, of course, as Mr. Acharya has already started that, we'll start with Mr. Deepak Dasgupta. He serves as a distinguished fellow with the Earth Science and Climate Change Division of TERI. He's a member of the core writing team of the synthesis report of the 6th Assessment IPCC, and a lead author of the Working Group 2 on mitigation. He was a founding board member of the Green Climate Fund 2012 to 2015 and chair facilitator of its investment committee. Thank you, sir, for agreeing to be part of this discussion. We also have with us Mr. Vijay Mahajan. He is the director of the Rajiv Gandhi Institute for Contemporary Studies, an internationally known Indian rural development professional, social entrepreneur, and policy analyst. He is the founder of reputed organizations such as the Pradhan NGO and the Basics Social Enterprise Group. He served on the Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority of India, Rangarajan Committee on Financial Inclusion, and the Raghuram Rajan Committee on Financial Sector Reforms. Thank you, VM, for agreeing to be a part of this panel. We also have with us Dhruva Purokaisto, the Director for Growth and Institutional Advancement with the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, the CEW, as most of us better know it. And he has over 30 years of experience in engineering industries, credit rating, management consulting, investment banking, and international development financing across many Asian countries. So prior to CEW, Dr. Dhruvo was the India Director for CPI, Climate Policy Initiative, working on sustainable finance and financing energy transition. Again, we're very happy to draw on your expertise this afternoon, sir. And finally, we also have with us Ms. Seher Raheja. Seher is a researcher with the Climate Change Program at the Center for Science and Environment, New Delhi. Her research focuses on climate finance, international climate negotiations, and the politics of climate change viewed through a lens of climate justice. She's worked as a campaigner for the Coastal Resource Center, Tamil Nadu, a Chhattisgarh-based grassroots people's movement, Save Hasdeo Forest, as well as Manthan Adhyayan Kendra. So again, we look forward to draw on your rich experience here as we go through this discussion. But again, just to set the ball rolling, Dhruvo, if I could lean on you to, for the sake of our participants, shed some light on the current state of play with respect to the quantum of finance and its sources. Over to you, Dhruvo. Oh yes, I'd better kind of mention our ground rules as well. We have about 40 minutes for this discussion, and I would kind of do this through a set of 2 rounds of questions, one question each round to each of my participants. And I'd ask you to restrict your answers to about 4 minutes. And then we will open this up to the audience for their questions. I request all the attendees to please feel free to use the Q&A box to keep addressing your questions to us. And we will try and address as many as we can in the last 30 minutes, as well as through the session as we go forward. So please use the Q&A box and keep it busy as we go forward. Dhruvo, over to you. Give us a bird's eye view, if you will, of the climate finance landscape.
Thank you, Professor Runa Sarkar, and very pleased to be in this session with all of us discussing what is called, getting called the finance COP. The understanding is the NCQG would succeed the so-called 100 billion USD target, which was in Copenhagen. But where let me try and attempt to kind of crystallize the issues first. Okay. At some level, this is purported to have been achieved in 22 from an OECD report, but there are few criticisms from the other side, and as to whether these numbers are correct and what should. So there are basically 2 issues which I see coming out as to what is climate finance and how much. They are both parts and from what sources. Now, basically, the criticisms are around whether the figures represent commitments or flows, whether these represent a reclassification of existing ODA, whether self-reporting of climate relevance projects by MDBs and bilaterals result in aggregation of what is being counted as climate finance, whether public capital on commercial terms and commercial capital flowing from Annex 1, or let's call it very simply from OECD to EMDE countries, will that be what will constitute, what will go in? Now, what we see and what is, yes, I agree with Swasti that it is desirable to converge. On one side, if you look at the number, it comes to 122 billion. And there are other reports from other institutions which place the number at 30 billion. So we are like, and we need to come to a bridge somewhere in between. And what I see is, the issue is whether this climate finance coming from developed world to the emerging world, or let's call it the developing countries, the last COP or last previous COP had put a number, and G20 also endorsed it, that the need is of the order of 1 trillion per annum. So that's documented. And it is expected that the NCQG would be able to mobilize that 1 trillion. So NCQG is about, this is the understanding, it needs to be new and additional. It needs to be public grant capital or grant equivalent. And whatever public capital goes in, that if it mobilizes through risk mitigation blended finance, that is the mobilizer part of the capital, which will get into 100. But if you are going to count private commercial capital, which would have been business as usual, this is where the problem between global south and global north is happening at this level of saying, okay, is it new and additional? What needs to be counted? And if it is mobilized capital, then what part of that mobilized capital is that mobilization happening because this is public capital transfer? So that's where the whole crux of the problem lies, and it needs to get converged at somewhere. And since it needs to, every negotiation is about getting towards a kind of a win-win and a common point. And I think it is eminently possible to drive this to a thinking that on one hand, we can't be negotiating that everything has to be a grant transfer. On the other hand, it is not that anything and everything that happens between the countries, or if a pension fund is investing in some renewable energy project, that also gets counted. So there are two ends of the spectrum. So the OECD reports counts everything. If a citizen were to be investing in an instrument of a green bond, that is also some citizen of a European country has put it in place. So therefore that gets counted. So this needs to come to a middle ground, and that middle ground is what I see as the context for this discussion of saying, what is the enabler finance that needs to be put, and what is the direct contribution? And final point, what I say is about, there is a triple agenda report which actually put it out in terms of what is required to be done in terms of both numbers from multilaterals, bilaterals, or primarily multilaterals put together. And therefore, this attempt of development finance or SDG finance getting reclassified as climate finance is another issue, because you can't just put another lens on that and say you would have anyway built a school or you would have built anyway a hospital, but now saying that 100 out of this 100, 50 is climate and therefore 50 gets contributed, that's another issue to be taken care of. So multiple issues, but we need a convergence of coming between what is called 30 and what is being placed at 122. And hopefully there will be a middle ground in this. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dhruvo, for in some senses giving us a very clear global south view of the global north perspective, and therefore opening up to us the chasm between the two. And in the spirit of dialogue, in the spirit of working towards a successful COP29, Seher, if I could then turn to you, and maybe you could share with us from the standpoint of the Global South. We do recognize, as Dhruvo has pointed out, that movement of new money has been quite disappointing, right? So
sorry, I
can you
missed one thing.
summarize?
Loss and damage is outside this. Sorry, Runa, I missed one thing. Loss and damage cannot be counted in this. That is another point of saying the loss and damage contribution is a different article altogether. So let's keep that out of this.
Absolutely. So that
4.3
shouldn't
is where
contribute to the flows. That shouldn't
no,
contribute to
that
the
should
flows for
should
development.
not be counted. Should not. That is the position. Should not
Correct.
be counted. Yeah.
Correct. Absolutely. Agree with you on that. And in that context, then, Seher, could you summarize for us, where the finance flows are coming from, where are they going to, and to what extent are these financial flows actually new and additional? That's something Dhruvo referred to. So can you shed some more light on that for us, please? Over to you.
Yeah. You can hear me fine?
Yes,
Yes.
perfect.
Thank you. So I think a lot of this has been covered, but I'll just kind of build on what the previous speakers have said and then get to answering your question very briefly. As we've already covered that a first formal target for collective mobilization, it wasn't a provision target ever, it was collective mobilization, was agreed upon after the Copenhagen Accord in 2009. And that's what's informally called the 100 billion commitment or target. And for the first time, this was supposedly met in 2022. And it was supposed to, and it's been a failure, like Mr. Acharya was saying at the start, and it's considered something that we need to learn a lot of lessons from as we enter into this NCQG negotiation. But I think it's good to note that even when that 100 billion mobilization target was decided, so to say, it was a highly political decision. It was one that came at the fag end of the Copenhagen negotiations. It wasn't actually decided upon in what some have called the true spirit of multilateralism, where you have enough real agreement, because it's a drop in the ocean compared to needs estimations of developing countries even then. Like, the G77 negotiators even then said, no, we need to, be getting at least a 400 to 500 billion per year annual commitment. And the second needs determination report, which came out just this year, also puts the range between, I think, 455 and 528 billion per year. So the understanding that a lot more is needed has always been there. So I think that speaks to the first part of your question of, from the global south, movement and actual inflow of money has been disappointing right from the target setting to the actual flows. So coming to where is this money coming from, how much has actually moved, and whether it's new and additional, I think the OECD is the one that has been tracking progress towards this goal and the flow of finance from developed to developing countries since 2015. They do analysis and kind of, aggregate a lot of data, and they've been tasked with this job of bringing out the latest figures. And like I said, only in 2022, reportedly, developed countries managed to provide and mobilize $115.9 billion towards developing countries. But almost 70% was in the form of loans. But yeah, the problem of quality is probably a different one that one of the experts on the panel can speak to. But some of the criticisms that Mr. Dhruba kind of mentioned briefly about this actual flow and whether that's even new and additional has come from groups such as Oxfam and other research organizations around the world. So they actually claim that, they do a kind of analysis of the OECD reporting through two main lenses. One of how much is the real climate relevance of what has been tagged as climate relevant, or the climate aspect of the funds that have been provided under the OECD analysis. And the second one of how much is the grant equivalent term of the money and the amounts that have actually been given, because that is a marker of real financial effort, it is called, by the developed countries who've been doing this sort of providing. So they kind of claim that the real range of money provided even in 2022 compared to the 115.9 that was reported was only between 28 and 35 billion. So that's also important to keep in mind when we're talking about what kind of finance actually gets used. About the question of new and additional flows, one, I think, and this was also mentioned in some way by the previous speakers, the absence of a kind of definition of both climate finance as well as a definition or an understanding of what additional even really means has led to a lot of murky waters and a lot of, kind of trying to utilize the ambiguity to the benefit of the people who are being asked to provide the money. So for instance, there was a great investigative reportage by Reuters some time ago, which said that $4.7 million were invested by Italy, and this was counted toward their climate finance provision. But this was actually used for opening up gelato stores across South Asia. And like, what does that even mean, right? So it's important to keep that context in mind as well. And more central to this question of additionality, though, I think is the context of ODA and ensuring that finance that comes for climate needs to be over and above the existing 0.7 GNI kind of commitment. And even Article 4 of the UNFCCC is widely understood to mean that ensuring increases in climate finance don't take place at the expense of other streams of bilateral and multilateral public sources, such as humanitarian assistance. So how much has actually happened? I think the UNFCCC biennial assessment in 2022 itself highlighted that much of the finance that was counted towards the 100 billion has included private finance, loans at market rate, or a reallocation of ODA. So a lot of it is not in fact additional, and what is being counted or considered additional, unfortunately, depends based on which stakeholders lens you're kind of looking at it from. And because I'm not a finance expert, but I have been tracking the policy and the politics closely, I'll stop there and highlight that a definition issue of both what is additional within this space as well as what is even climate finance both feed into this question of not enough money coming onto the table as climate finance. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much for that, Sir. You've the concerns that we have in terms of not having additional or having finance flows which are really not new or additional. I think you've really brought out, especially with the gelato example out there. And it's bizarre how that works. But maybe at this point, I can ask Dr. Dasgupta to step in And maybe you could comment on the types of finance and instruments that are there at present. And in this context, whether you have some suggestions for innovative or inclusive mechanisms. So, in this context, Avinash Prasad has been talking about maybe a mechanism through which you could absorb exchange rate risk as a mechanism to kind of facilitate finance flows into developing countries. So what do you think of those kind of approaches and so on? So if you could shed some light then on the financial instruments and mechanisms aspect of this.
Okay, thank you, Runa. So first of all, thank you, and good to see everyone on this table on talking about a subject that's terribly, terribly important for us in India, for the world as a whole, and whether we succeed with climate finance or not is going to make a huge difference to the prospects ahead. So having said that, I'm really especially delighted to see Abhishek Acharya here, and he's been my colleague, and I wish him and all at the table who will be discussing these issues at Baku intensively that they come to a useful conclusion. This COP is extremely important to get us to a breakthrough. And we don't want to be in the same spot as we have been, which is struggling with the questions of essentially a political economy argument as to who should contribute and who should and in what terms. The problem is that this is as we've in every report that when we look at it in detail, the issue is what we call in public finance a wicked problem. A wicked problem is, in its sense, somebody who generates a cost and is therefore there is no international mechanisms to finance that cost or to apportion costs and its ability to finance. These three becomes intertwined, and we can't seem to find a solution in the space of global negotiations. So we get stuck in this question of what is new and additional, what are the types of finance flows. That's where I think Mr. Acharya has been very clear, is that we are actually talking about speed, scale, and quantum to be delivered very fast, because if we don't make it, the consequences and the costs are 10 times larger. And the costs are going to be on the developing countries. So if we fail to mitigate, 80 to 90% of the mitigation energy emissions are going to be coming in developing countries to meet their energy demands. So the finance is a question of financing their ability to make the clean energy transition. So that's the first type of financing. And the world's capital markets, unfortunately, 90% of the capital markets are in the developed countries. So the question that we're struggling with is not the politics. The politics will resolve itself one way or another. But at the heart is the financial challenge of taking flows from large, well-developed capital markets, which are dealing with $218 trillion, and finding that additional $1 trillion which needs to flow towards clean energy transition. We have absolutely no problem in the global economy in financing, not just gelators. We finance all kinds of things with the $218 trillion of money that flows across in the global capital markets. Problem is, how do we solve this climate problem, and in a way that is, and it is possible. So the question, the feasible, it is so feasible that what needs to happen are some innovative financial instruments. So of course we have the debt markets, we have the bond markets, we have the official flows, we have the private flows. Underlying it essentially is the problem that developing countries will not be able to access global capital markets at costs and prices that they need to be able to access without supporting structures officially and publicly from developed countries. One way to do it is a guarantee instrument. One of the oldest such instruments around the world, every time we've seen massive transitions of this scale happening. Think about when we were building railways across the world. It happens in the mid-1850s. Railways are being constructed all over the world. Global capital markets paid for it. Governments didn't finance. It does not happen without state guarantees. State backs up those financial flows. So that's our argument. When it comes to electrification, exactly the same things happen. Private finance flows only when public monies are backing it with policies and with its financial guarantees. So we are pushing very hard on this idea that financial guarantee is one element of the innovation that has to take place. And fortunately or otherwise, this is being discussed at G20, at G7, and every forum. Understand one thing that is very clear to us is that there are finance discussions at COPs are not a very, COPs are not a critical place for finance decisions. Why? Decisions on finance are taken by governments and essentially treasury. Decisions are taken by ministries of finance and central banks and banking systems. Unfortunately, COPs are not a very good place for those discussions. But COPs provide the political backing. So therefore, COPs are actually interesting that they set the tone and then make instructions or mandates for finance and treasury and other decision makers and central banks to make the right calls. And so we are pushing very hard that it is time to send a message from the COP to the community of finance transactors and leadership that now is the time for you to come to the stage, make those calls that you have to make at G7, make those calls at G20, and one of them is guarantee instruments. The other instrument that we keep talking about, and it's so vital that we should not miss the boat, that you need public grant money at the table. One way or another, you can't fill a gap this big with loanable funds. Even with guarantees, there's not enough public finance to be able to cover it. You need, therefore, public finance. Public finance will not come without global taxation of one kind or another. And we need a scale of global taxation, which is significant. Now, no finance ministry in the world is ever going to agree to a global taxation provision. So what we are hoping will happen is that the proposals for higher tax revenues that countries get, some part of it will be apportioned to a redistribution. So it's something that has to come with carbon taxes. It will start with a blend and a mix of instruments. We are starting to think that you need at least 6 instruments, small taxes to get the public finances flowing. One is carbon taxes. I think its time has come that we've talked about carbon taxes for so long. We need to start imposing taxes to fund the climate energy transition globally. The second that we have to do is extremely high net worth individuals around the world, including in India, including everywhere, tax them. I mean, there's a time where the highest spending and the highest emissions that are done globally are by the absolutely thinnest margin there were more private aircraft landing at the noted at these COP conferences that really we should be ashamed that we do have these conferences taking place without a sense of where the liabilities need to be. So that's the high net worth taxes. We time to start to implementing the financial transactions tax. It's a small credit card charge. Every credit card, we spend money, we are happy to pay the visas and the others small. It's time to pay a small credit card charge every time you do emissions and you do spending in the global sense. It's time that we started to do aviation and bunker fuel taxes. Once you collect, and these taxes, when we take together, once you collect that, it's not very difficult to transfer $1 trillion, retransfer. You're not transferring the whole amount. You're raising taxes wherever they should be raised, but you're allocating a portion of the global funds And this is happening in both North and South. The taxation should go on all places, but some proportion needs to be reallocated back on global equity concerns on a per capita income and a population basis. So this blend of essentially we think is the answer, is the blend of use the power of public guarantees to back up the private monies to flow cross-border, and use the power of public finance to provide the equitable clean energy adaptation, loss and damage transitions. But this won't happen at COP. COP is not a place where financial decisions are made. COP is a place where political decisions need to be made. And those political decisions then need to give instructions to the World Banks, to the ministries of finance, to the IMF, to the central banks. You're now instructed to take the decisions that we have agreed and undertaken. Otherwise, I'm sorry, Baku is going to be another disaster. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Dasgupta. The underscoring, if you will, the need for public finance to lead this entire process. We're getting some very, very interesting questions in the webinar chat window. May I please request you to put in your questions into the Q&A box, because that's easier for us to track. And then we would address them as and when they come. Having done that, Mr. Vijay Mahajan, if I can now ask you where, maybe you can then tell us which are the sectors and activities that climate finances have been flowing towards. Because we do understand that a large part of the financial flows have been towards mitigation. Whereas adaptation, especially sitting in Kolkata today with the shadow of a cyclone hitting Orissa probably by the middle of the night, the shadow of adaptation costs are loom on us. And yet the kind of finance flows to adaptation are quite limited. Of course, as Dhruvo said, we'll keep loss and damage out of the picture because that's not really coming in as part of the climate COP Baku for or defining climate finance. So in this context, can you shed a little more light on which sectors and activities actually get attention, which sectors should get attention, and how?
Thank you, Runa, and it's a pleasure to be in this panel. I've had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Dasgupta earlier as well, and of course, hearing the other speakers, very nice. I come from exactly the other end of the world, from the $1 trillion that we've been talking of. Most of my life, I've worked with small farmers and micro entrepreneurs, and in the process, I realized that just getting finance for them, what I call livelihood finance itself, used to be a huge issue. And now, due to climate change, what has happened is that livelihoods are seriously threatened. I mean, it's most obvious in case of agriculture, where due to changes in rainfall pattern, due to extreme heat waves, unseasonal cold waves, hailstorms, occasional cyclones, all of that, there is the yield risk for farmers has gone up dramatically. And since large part of India's 14 crore farmers are small and marginal farmers, over 85%. So, for them, it's one such setback is enough to sort of bring them below the poverty line. But even these roughly 75 million enterprises, non-farm enterprises that are there in India, of which, by the way, nearly 65 million are, again, what are called own account enterprises. That is, there is no hired worker in them. Typically, it is it's a self-employed person and one family member. The average employment is only 1.8. So even those are, and the fact that about 20% of them have no fixed premises and another 15% are seasonal in nature, means that they are also very much open to the elements and, all these adverse events related to climate make a big difference to just operating and surviving. So, so really speaking, uh, adaptation finance and finance for resilience, because they suffer from so many shocks, needs to flow to this part of the population. Exactly what Dr. Dasgupta was talking about in terms of global equity considerations, in terms of funds flowing on a per capita basis, and taking into account uh, population and per capita incomes. The same internal logic needs to be applied even within India. And if you look at that, if we apply the same lens here, then as it is, we are as a nation short of climate finance. A large part of that, more than 90% perhaps, is going toward mitigation. The single digit percentage that comes for adaptation and resilience building, again, very small part of that gets to these 12 crore farmers and 6-7 crore micro entrepreneurs. So out of 33 crore households in India, almost 20 crore households are the sector that I'm talking about, and they are the ones who really need adaptation and resilience finance. So the question is, should it be purely charitable? Dr. Dasgupta did mention that we will, even globally, we need some grant finance component from the public finance side, and certainly I think that's true domestically as well. But having worked for a long time in poverty alleviation and microfinance, in general, quite sadly, subsidies which are just given out without any significant caveats tend to get misused. There's a lot of leakage, a lot of patronage, political patronage, and then once it reaches the eventual household, there is misuse. You would have all heard stories about how money from which goes into a woman's bank account is, the husband threatens her and gets her to withdraw it, and then uses it to consume alcohol and so forth. So no amount of technical fixes are going to do that. What will fix is really building individual and household and community level capacity to deal with climate change and its adverse consequences. Now, that's a very tall order, but we can take heart from the fact that, for example, in the mid-90s, when I started in the microfinance world, we had no self-help groups in this country. The RBI sanctioned a project to link 3,000 self-help groups to the banking system in 1992. By 1996, 5,500 were linked. Well, going fast forward, now India has 1.1 crore, 11 million self-help groups, and 90% of them are linked with banks. Linked meaning they all of course have bank accounts. That's how they're counted, and they save some money in it. But when I say linked, that means they've received some money from the banks. So the fact that this whole movement got built in front of our own eyes is nearly ubiquitous. Gives me heart to say that we can actually have a nationwide movement at the grassroots to absorb, climate action flows that will arise, and so that it remains disciplined. I would say that it should be structured as long-term loans rather than as pure grants. There should be some grant component. It can be in the form of interest subsidies or, catastrophic insurance and stuff like that. But, pure grants tends to get frittered away. Secondly, interestingly, these people can also generate finance. How? Because all of them will sequester tiny amounts of carbon dioxide. A household may save maybe 1 to 2 tons a year. Now it all gets frittered away because nobody wants to come and deal with this kind of transactions. But as you know, Rona, you were the chair of the small company that we used to run called CTRAN, where the whole idea was to aggregate micro certified emission reductions, AMCERs or AMSERs as we call them. And if we have to actually convert the large number of poor or lower income households and micro entrepreneurs and farmers into actors rather than recipients of climate change disaster, then we need to enable them to aggregate these micro CERs. And then, of course, once they aggregate it, then they can be, offered for trade and all of that. I would very much request Professor Dasgupta to think about this suggestion, but also Dhruva, because he's worked in that kind of context, whether he thinks there's any virtue in that idea of creating a pool of AMSERs, as I call them, aggregated micro CERs, because it changes then the dynamic of not being only a recipient, but actually a proactive actor. I would just end by saying that the resilience component is financially best served through insurance. I used to be a member of the Insurance Regulatory Development Authority of India for 5 years. And the reason I got elevated to that position is because for several years before that, I worked on a series of micro-insurance products and helped the IRDA come up with the world's first micro-insurance policy framework. So basically, the lives of lower income households are full of all kinds of perils. And what they need is a multi-peril insurance, something which covers fires, floods, droughts, cyclones, even things like theft, and separately health and livestock, health insurance for humans and livestock. If this is made, the reason why this is not affordable right now is because a lot of these pools are not yet insurable at any reasonable cost. And therefore, that work needs to be done by the adaptation folks. Once that risk becomes insurable, then maybe part of it can be, part of the premium can be subsidized. And then that would give us a fantastic resilience framework, a financial framework for resilience. Resilience is more than just money. There's psychological and sociological aspects, but at least the financial thing will focus. I thought in pursuit of Baku, we should stay financial in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, VM. In the spirit of what Swasti said when we started out, we can now see that investments and climate finance flows into adaptation can lead to tangible benefits, and those benefits indeed then contribute to mitigation themselves. So thank you for pointing that out. But with the sobering thought that Dr. Dasgupta left us with, which is the limitations of what COP29 can do and focus on, let me also now focus specifically just on COP29. And in that context, Seher, if I can ask you about how the countries from the global south are designing their ask for climate finance from the NCQGs. Right? Could you kind of tell us the key points of divergence and convergence that would be expected at the negotiations of climate finance as we are entering the Baku COP? And I'd request all the panelists to be a little brief so we can address the very interesting questions at the end. Also, Seher would have to leave around a little after 3. So if there are specific questions addressed to Seher, if you could kind of identify that in the Q&A box, then we'll ensure that Seher answers that before she has to leave. Over to you, Seher.
Right. I've also responded a little bit in the chat, so happy to do that as, before I leave. So I think I'll just answer your question in the two parts that you've asked it in. To begin with, how are countries from the global south or within the negotiations, what would be the developing country groups? How are they designing their ask, or what is their ask from the NCQG? And do bear in mind that this is a summary in the interest of time, so there are always nuances, but this is the kind of overarching thrust of what they're asking for. I think, first of all, G77 and China, which is the biggest negotiating bloc there, it represents 134 developing countries. So far, they've actually shown unity for an ask for an adequate and fair finance goal. On the specific elements which have been debated since 2022 across 11 technical expert dialogues and 3 ad hoc work program meetings just this year, this is what developing country groups primarily under the umbrella of G77 and China have been saying. On quantum, we've seen several proposals from different developing countries and groups to the tune of trillions. So 1 trillion has been proposed by India, actually, as well as the like-minded developing countries, 1 trillion per year until 2030 for all developing countries. 1.1 trillion was proposed by the Arab group, as advocated for by Saudi Arabia at the negotiations. And the African group of negotiators, which represents a host of African countries, have said we want at least 1.3 trillion per year. And Pakistan, in a standalone submission, has also asked for 2 trillion. So essentially, the range is, between 1 and 2 trillion. And this kind of is far above what the needs determination report of the Standing Committee on Finance says, which is about 455 to 528 billion per year. But I think that's also because that figure that has been used based on the needs determination report is actually only representative of the money needed to implement NDCs among various other types of climate action plans and climate action that countries need. And within the NDCs, it's only representative of the plans of 98 countries because they're the only ones that had costed needs mentioned in them. So we're looking at a lot of the official estimates are conservative estimates. And so when, it's very easy to hear this narrative of this is a political conversation and an ask of like 1 trillion per year is just unlikely and impossible. Maybe the technical experts are here. I'm not going to comment on that. But the ask is coming from a place of official estimates on the table are very conservative. So maybe this is not that much of a stretch. But that's on quantum. On structure, the countries from the global south have primarily asked for a provision as well as a mobilization component. So they're not looking for this to be a repeat of the 100 billion, where it is just a commitment to collectively mobilize. The general kind of statements and inputs at the negotiations, which as CSC we have the privilege of also attending, has been that they want this to be provision as well as mobilization. And they've asked for thematic sub-goals of adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. So I thought it was interesting that Mr. Dhruva at the start, very kind of explicitly said that loss and damage should not be a part of this. I suppose that's the position that he was coming from. But as far as the negotiations go and what we've been tracking, the developing countries are kind of trying to push for including loss and damage in there as well, along with adaptation and mitigation sub-goals within the NCQG. So that's on quantum and structure. On quality, the primary ask has been a public core, multilateral, international public finance, whether that's bilateral or multilateral through contributions to funds or through contributions to MDBs. And the question of grants versus loans and market rate debt, the way it has played out so far has been that specifically for adaptation and loss and damage, the ask has been more for grants. And for mitigation, it's like, okay, maybe concessional loans at best, but market rate debt largely, what we've been seeing and hearing is that market rate debt can't really be considered climate finance. And that's the kind of ambition which developing countries are trying to push for. And as far as recipients, as to who should receive this, and who should be prioritized are concerned, groups like ILAC, which is Latin American countries and the Caribbean, the least developed countries groups, the Alliance of Small Island States, and the African group of negotiators, they want their special circumstances recognized. So there is a sense, this is where a little bit of a, disunity among the G77 comes in, because certain countries that are more vulnerable basis various criteria are suggesting that they need to be prioritized for receiving the money because there's already going to be a scarcity of it, judging by, past evidence of how finance scopes go. But yeah, as far as the mandate and scope, like what does the NCQG, what is the scope, why is this goal being discussed, and what is the premise of how the NCQG should be operationalized is concerned, developing countries have been very clear that it needs to be a reading of Article 9.1 along with 9.3 of the Paris Agreement. They need to be read together. and which essentially says that this needs to be a goal that entails money, financial support from developed to developing countries. Now, why that's important, and I will be brief. I know you asked us. I think I'm at exactly 4 minutes right now. Just one more minute. Why that's important about the scope that is being advocated for, I think, is because the key issues actually of divergence between the developed country and developing country groups, I'm using that as a proxy for global north and global south because that's how it plays out in the negotiations. The key issues have been essentially on quantum, contributor base, and quality. The contributor base being a really tricky one. So on quantum, when I listed out, the range of 1 to 2 trillion proposals that were actually put forward by various developing country groups and separate countries, there's been no engagement and no proposal on quantum from the developed side. So no number has actually come out. And not only has no number come out for what the goal could be, there has also been no response to these numbers. Now, why hasn't there been a response to these numbers? Because increasingly over the last 2 years, they have said that we don't want to talk amount or quantum until we can discuss who is being tasked with providing this money first. So they've been saying that the contributor base for this goal needs to be expanded to reflect modern economic realities, which is basically a hint at saying include countries whose GNI in today's day and age are high, who have high current emissions, and move away from the Annex 2 of 1992 because the world has changed significantly since then. But the developing country pushback has just been stop adding more responsibility onto us. This is not the time and space to discuss what has changed and what hasn't changed and whether the annexes need a relooking. Not that anyone's in denial about the changes, in global scenarios, but this has become this has been called a bargaining chip or a way to kind of hold the negotiations hostage until contributor-based question is answered on no discussion on any of the other elements by the developed country groups. And even on the quality and structure, there's been a divergence because more developed countries such as US, EU, Canada, Switzerland, they have been emphasizing a greater role for the private sector. And they've been suggesting a structure of a multi-layered goal rather than the thematic sub-goals that I mentioned earlier for the developing country groups. And they've emphasized that the first layer should be a global investment layer. But again, developing countries have been saying that this is kind of a dilution of responsibility from the provision of finance that we're trying to hold them accountable for. I think I'll just end by saying that there are a lot of lessons from the 100 billion commitment that can and should be incorporated as we go into COP29. And that was a very quick summary of what has been, more than 2 years of discussion. So forgive me if I missed any nuance. But yeah, I think a lot of narrative about this is not going to have an outcome. This might be a failed COP. The US election is more important. All of that outside the UNFCCC is happening. A lot is always happening. But we are entering COP with a lot of deadlocks. And the hope is that some kind of fair compromise can come. I'll just end on a hopeful note rather than a realistic note at this point.
All right, hopeful but not realistic. Okay, that's an interesting way of putting it. In order to make things more real, we do realize that this target of 1.5 degrees, possibly the target of not exceeding 1.5 degrees of global warming is itself hopeful and not real. And in that context, VM, if you could maybe say what implications that would have on the way the different countries would set their NCQGs in Baku next month. Do you have any thoughts on how the Global South would kind of define their goals, knowing that the world is getting hotter and climate events are becoming more frequent? VM, you're on mute. VM, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Sorry, I think while it's important to deal with the aggregates, whether it's 1 trillion or 2 trillion or something in between, and to be realistic, it might just be $500 billion, and even that would be 5 times more than what has been promised and not fully coming. But still, I mean, very large numbers. But my view is that we should attempt, and indeed for India, I have, following the aphorism that fools rush in where angels fear to tread, I've actually attempted making an estimate as to what the masses need in terms of resources. So I've taken, including mitigation needs, but for the lower income households of India. So basically, in my calculations, I've excluded everything which can be called industrial, related to industrial emissions or the organized sector and all of that. But everything else, which is basically individuals, households, small farms, micro enterprises, and the village commons, Jal Jangal Zameen, because that's very much a part of the lives and livelihoods of India's masses. With that, my calculations, and of course it's based on many heroic assumptions, but it comes to just for India alone, it comes to 330 billion US dollars. Okay, now this could be, there could be errors or assumptions can change, but if this has to be done for India alone, and then if we just multiply it by 6, because India is roughly 1/6 of the world population, just to keep it very simple, we are already in the Pakistan estimate range of $2 trillion. So, I don't think our neighbors to the west are very much wrong if they've done it with some grassroots. But to me, the number doesn't matter. What matters is the methodology and an agreement on the methodology. And also the commitment at COP29 does not matter as long as people realize that it has to be financed. And thereafter, I think all sides can get together and say, okay, objectively speaking, the world needs $3 trillion or whatever to really address this. Then, since the world is not ready to give that, or the developed world is not ready to give that, right now there's 1 trillion. What can it be prioritized for, and what will give the maximum rates of return, including those things which will actually enable some regeneration of finance through the carbon sequestration mechanism, and kick in some other type of finance beyond public finance, the voluntary carbon markets and all of that. So I think what we are lacking in all these big estimates is a bottom-up methodology. And I think it can be done. We have, at least in India, very good large data aggregates. And, we need micro studies to determine the multiplier, and then we can very quickly do that. So I have attempted that. I'll be sharing that paper with you soon. And I think if we can get to Baku and come back with even $250 billion, but real stuff, not just renaming, not gelato shops, then it'll be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Dasgupta, I'd like to kind of also remind us that COP29 is happening not only under the shadow of the US elections, but also under the very real shadow of wars and impending strife across almost every continent. So in this context, would this be a good time for us to move away from, say, a country-based approach to one based on geographical regions, if you will, when we are talking about adaptation, etc., considering that there are regions that are affected similarly by climate change, irrespective of their national boundaries?
Yes, very much so, very much so. Not just for the reason, wars is a whole different business. I think as human beings, we've seen societies can spend enormous sums when it comes to war expenditures, when it comes to peacetime capabilities, building resilience, climate change. We seem to be falling far short. That's one reason. But a more important reason is for the reasons that I think Vijay Mahajan is correct, that we need to start to focus on people, and we need to start to focus on communities. We need to start thinking about not just by sovereign states, but start to think about where and which places are the greatest, and which communities are at greatest risk as the world starts to warm inexorably, and how should we deal? And therefore, sub-regions become terribly important. So think of, we have started some work on the Bay of Bengal region, and we're looking at, and right now, tonight, I presume, is the evening that in Calcutta where you are, you're looking at a cyclone bearing down at you in Orissa and coming to West Bengal. And it's going to cause, we hope, as little harm as possible, but it is also likely, every scientific evidence is telling us Bay of Bengal region is going to be one of the worst affected, climate affected regions in the world. They also have per capita incomes as a group in these 7 countries and around the coastal areas. They're the most exposed communities, least income with poverty rates, very high conflict happening because they're unable to deal with the consequences and rising consequences in the future. And there are many such sub-regions around the world. There are about 7 or 8 sub-regions that make sense. And from these perspectives, I think Vijay is correct. We need to be starting to think and appealing to the world that it's time to change the ways in which governments spend money, the ways in which they reach out to communities most in need, and regional development strategies, regional resilience strategies may be one critical answer. And we've started, therefore, looking at the question of what happens in this Bay of Bengal region. It's a region of about 1 billion people, which is about 1/7 to 1/8 of the global total. So this is not small. And this one region, the cyclone that's coming, bearing on us, once again, Bay of Bengal is interesting. That single region, other than in southern United States, has the highest incidence of these cyclones, and they are also causing, the Bay of Bengal is warming much faster than anywhere else. So the entire fish stocks are getting depleted. So we're looking at situations which therefore needs everyone's help to start thinking about a very different future, how the world wishes to, how we think communities should be empowered to look after their own and what is at stake. So that's why, yes, regions make a huge difference. I may have to leave for another back-to-back meeting that I have, unfortunately, but my best wishes to the teams that are going to be in Baku, that they will come up with the right solution. Sometimes we look for miracles to happen, and if there is a miracle that we need right now, we need a miracle in right thinking taking place at Baku that does not dissolve into protecting petty national interests and starts to think about where the consequences are the greatest. And humanity is capable of solving these problems if we are out of our narrow interests that we always belong to. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dasgupta.
Before you go, just for 30 seconds,
yes, of
I
course.
want to, since you spoke about Bay of Bengal, we've been doing some work in the Sundarbans with some NGOs. And every time I go there, I'm really worried about the livelihood prospects of those people. So we, in a very, very tiny way, we've come up with a suggestive solution called ALO, which is amphibious livelihood opportunities. We have to just assume that there will be a lot of incursion of saline water, even in the places they're cultivating, and the whole fish stock businesses, as you mentioned. So there'll be just, these possibilities of. So essentially, assuming that large population transfers may not be possible because of geopolitical reasons, then can people still make a living while they are there in face of climate change? We need some good region-specific micro research on that. And I'm so delighted that you've zoomed onto that issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vijay. I look forward to that conversation deepening. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so
and
much for
Alo,
that.
of course, in Bangla means light.
Light.
It's true. My granddaughter is named Alu.
Wow.
Okay. Great.
So indeed, a very, very pragmatic approach now where we are counting, if you will, on human agency to essentially find a solution. And therefore, Dhruvo, I will have you in some senses try and have the last word in, telling us what can we expect, therefore, from COP29, what's the best case, what's the worst case scenario, and what exactly, what must we do, what must the Global South do to elicit, if you will, the most favorable outcome from COP?
No, thank you, Rona. Let me start by agreeing to what Mr. Deepak Dasgupta said, rather agreeing to all of it here. And let me just build on that in terms of what can be done. Let me start with the political part, political versus economy and finance, and where's the gap? While I completely agree with Mr. Mahajan's points of human misery, and therefore the need to support that through a variety of means of social protection or otherwise. But let's get to the basics. The basics are, and there is a huge amount of confusion in the basics across the world. The basics are very simple. It all started with 2006 Lord Stern report when it said very clearly and underscored that climate change is the biggest market failure which human economic development has seen in history. Now, where is it fundamentally going wrong and becomes politics is after a point of time, enforced politically, we start thinking the markets are going to solve for market failures, which is like a classic contradiction in the basic concept. Now, come around 20 years later or 18 years later and look at what the last COP talked about. And I'll bring in Deepak's point a couple of times and underscore that. One, you have had 20 countries in G20 and UNFCCC COP write it down and declare 5.9 trillion investment incrementally required in climate change. Now look at the impossibility of that. It's a 97 trillion economy with roughly 13% savings rate. And therefore, the world cannot mobilize 6 trillion incremental investment, but it's written down, right? So the political leaders agree to that, 6 trillion. Let me give you another contradiction. Total installed base of renewable energy, 12,000 gigawatts. We'll triple it in 3 years, 3x by 2030. You don't even have a pipeline of 5,000 gigawatt across the world. You will triple it in few years' time. So these are all signed off declaration. Now let's understand where it again goes wrong is the 1 trillion number, the 1 trillion. I agree with the UNFCCC submissions that the countries have done. The needs range from 1.3 or 1 trillion to 2 trillion. All that is fine. These are TNFA submissions which the countries are doing. But the issue is not that. The issue that is getting discussed in NCQG is basically saying it's the CBDR issue. I know it's been beaten to death, common but differentiated responsibility. It is about saying that, yeah, there is Annex 1, Annex 2 issues, countries have changed, and there is dispute whether China and Saudi Arabia and Qatar should be there. Let's cut to chase in the elementary aspects of it. The elementary aspects are very simple. The elementary aspects are there is 100 billion contribution and any guarantee, and that's why again underscoring what Deepak said, any guarantee at a global level would mobilize 7 to 10x, which is pretty simple to say that if I were to use this guarantee capital for guarantee, it will mobilize more money. And that is where private capital can come in and get mobilized to invest in developing countries in climate action. So when we look at the mobilized, so now if you are counting the mobilized capital within that, it is like becoming a recursive problem which cannot get solved. It's a simple mathematical recursion. So you will keep on counting and you will keep on counting, it will never get solved because this 100 is supposed to do 10x, is supposed to do 7x, and that's global. And that brings me to another point Deepak made. So you cannot meet this from a simple macroeconomic output, savings, intermediation. Having said that, where will this money come from? That brings me to the options that Deepak was outlining in terms of tax this, tax that, tax emissions, tax everyone. Yes, those are important points of looking at. Where can you get that money from? And yeah, the economic construct of what Deepak was talking about has been talked for ages. And it's not only in climate. You need to put in that Tobin's tax on speculative high net worth transactions. That is one simple part of it. The other part of it is, if you try and look at it, development is not about output. And that is what we have always. Now, obviously, it is not considered, Piketty is not considered to be a pariah economist, and therefore you don't bring in the concept of the what the capital is there in the stock of the capital that the world has. And that he was alluding to that 230 trillion, you have 110, 140 trillion in the money bags in terms of who have signed up to GFANs. You need a small shift in their capital allocation away from oil and gas. That is all you need to do. It is about how regulation and governments push this capital aside. And it just does not even need to be actual fiscal allocation, because if the countries, the OECD countries, are in good sovereign shape, I'm not even bringing in the other issues. I'll come to the other issues of loss and damage. I'm not saying loss and damage does not need to get addressed. Loss and
So,
damage
Dhruvo, you have
is not a
about
part
3
of it.
minutes. Dhruvo, you
I'll
have
just
about
I'll
3
just end
minutes, so
this.
keep it in that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just end this. The loss and damage can be dealt with it separately and should be dealt with it. But herein comes the issue of what can the COP do? The COP can basically bring them onto the table in terms of converging on saying, this is exactly what will get provided. Let this get counted through various mechanisms of. Now, bringing in GNI per capita and 0.7, that has never been met for the last 20 years. I mean, you bring that up into that the highest that has reached has been 0.38% from what was committed. And that is finance for development, Monterey, Addis. We can mix all that, then the picture will get lost. So yes, there is a commitment on that, but that has not been met, which is fine. But let's work the way forward, and a small percentage, 0.1, can do the job in terms of such commitments. If when it were got, where it comes from can be counted, and then taxation could then create a more even playing field. So I'll stop here.
Great. Yes, thank you so much. Of course, I'm conscious of the time, and I see that we have about 5 minutes left, which I'd like to hand over to Professor Mrityunjay Mohanty, my colleague, to talk about the closing remarks. There are about a couple of questions that are unanswered, and I know we had mentioned that we will address them. So what we will do is we will get back to you over email on each of the questions. But I'm sorry that we cannot actually pose them to the panel simply because we are conscious of the time. So Mrityunjay, over to you for the difficult job of summarizing several key points that came across during this discussion. Mrityunjay, you're on mute.
Yes, thanks, Runa. And it really is a very difficult job because it was such a wide-ranging and informative discussion. It touched on key issues. So let me start right at the very beginning with what Mr. Acharya had to say, is that one of the things that developing countries have found most difficult to do is to access. And COP needs to address the problem of access. And where you put that, where you locate that in the center of COP29 negotiations will determine the way that it goes forward. Dhruvo, in his first set of interventions, raised the issues of what you commit to and the importance of flows, and the question of mobilizing, right, and new additional of costs. The other important thing was the fact that Drew pointed out that one must not expect, and it is not right, that everything should be a grant. I think that's very important to keep, even as grants are important in themselves and as leveraging. Even so, everything cannot be a grant. And second, to ensure the fact that SDG finance must not be reclassified as climate finance. Following Rubov had some very interesting points to make. One of the first of which was the fact that actually 100 billion, it was neither here nor there. It was a political statement. But we must remember, however, that all COPs are political statements. And this is a point Deepak made, and quite rightly so, that this political statement that COPs make provides the backbone and the framework with which negotiations get determined. Which is why COP28 was so important, because it for the first time used the word of transitioning away from all fossil fuels. So political statements in themselves are very important. And I come to what Deepak was saying, Deepak Dasgupta, and here it was such a nice phrase to capture the whole problem, which is that, it's a wicked problem. The people who, the countries that generate the cost, and not the countries that bear the cost, and so on. But how do you solve it? And I think one of the key interventions that he made is that when you look over the 200 years of capitalist growth, state guarantees have been very important ways in which you mobilize commercial resources. It's true in railways, it's true in electricity. If we can effectively mobilize state guarantees, as Dhruva mentioned, with state guarantees, you leverage that 7 or 10 times. So that's number one. Number two, of course, he detailed a bunch of taxes. And so that you need to address politically the issue is, am I going to use tax resources to get you the new and additional? Once I agree on that, then we can talk about the distribution. And I think Vijay's intervention brought it down to the issue of livelihoods, which is so critical to this debate. Because very, very often we miss this picture that really climate change is about livelihoods of people who don't have a voice. And we're out of 6 billion, that covers about 5 billion people. And particularly, you want to look at in India, where 85% of farmers are small and marginal, or 7 million SMEs. It's really that they bear that. And again, Deepak made this point, and Vijay both made this point, equity considerations are key. And one must not run away from the fact that you have to keep equity considerations center stage in ensuring the fact that you help livelihoods getting protected, livelihoods becoming more resilient. And finally, I mean, again, it's very important when he this thing about community capacities. The moment subsidies are involved, what the subsidies get used for becomes very critical. Very often they're wasted, leaks, and so on and so forth. And the fact that community capacities give you the ability to ensure that they'll get spent properly. And in this, he pointed out that even though it looks like a mountain to climb, we have successfully used self-help groups. Now, in the second round of issues, again, Shahar mentioned the range of estimates involved, and the necessity, therefore, of countries to talk both about mobilization and provisioning. Right, the moment you talk, the focus on provision, to learn the lessons from the 100 billion disaster that it was, the importance of special and differentiated treatment for developing countries. And yet the big elephant in the room is that the quantum has never been addressed adequately. Again, I think Vijay's second intervention raised the very important issues of small and marginal farmers and enterprises using carbon sequestration as a part of their coping strategies. And if you can aggregate that and make them scale them and make them tradable, then actually it's a way in which you can also earn incomes and money, right? Finally, I think one of, again, just as livelihoods don't get mentioned in debates, just this, regions don't get mentioned in debates such as this. The importance of regions, and again, Deepak Dasgupta brought this, the importance of the Bay of Bengal, and that just that region houses 1/6 of the population of people, and a lot of them very vulnerable, right? So if we can bring countries together to have a collective voice, which is regional, allows you to have a different view at COP. And finally, Dhruva ending pointed out the fact that it's been a market failure of gigantic proportions is something everybody agrees on. Yet, we all believe that markets left to themselves can solve market failure. Of course, hope or fantasy. But hopefully, we will not leave it to markets in COP29 alone, right? With this, I round up what's a fascinating discussion. Thank you to all our panelists and to the wonderful questions which our participants have written up, some of which we've been able to address and some of which we haven't. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mrityunjay, Mohanty. We would finally like to close this webinar, but we hope you found the discussion useful and informative. Before we close, again, I would like to reiterate, as Professor Mohanty did, that we would like to thank our partners, IIM Calcutta, firstly for the generous support in helping us elevate these discussions on the topic from experts in India. The experts who cordially joined us today, ISG's communication team for supporting us with the logistics at the back end. And lastly, but most importantly, all the participants who actively engaged with the discussions and kept the Q&A moving. So with that, we'll close this webinar, wishing everyone a good day ahead, and we'll try to deepen this discussion in subsequent editions of this webinar series. Thank you.